My name is David Johnson, and I used to believe that nothing, and I mean nothing, could shake the foundation of the life my wife Anna and I had built here in Austin. We were the picture of normal married 3 years, our little condo, filled with secondhand IKEA furniture, and the sound of our son Mateo's gurgling laughter each morning. I balanced spreadsheets for a renewable energy startup by day. Anna taught pre-K in a public school, spending her evenings grading papers and dreaming up finger paint projects. We were 30 miles from where Anna grew up, carving out our own future 4 flights of stairs at a time, 2 paychecks at a time. And then someone decided to weaponize the very system I thought existed to protect families like ours. And in a single morning, our reality shattered, and with it everything I ever took for granted about security justice or blind faith in government agencies. It started with a knock at the door. I was halfway through a cup of Kona coffee, eyeing my laptop, and a stack of quarterly projections I needed to finish before lunch, when I heard Anna's voice wavering. "David, CPS is here." My heart sank. I shuffled down the stairs to find a clipboard-wielding woman in a plain blue blouse, her expression unreadable. She said she was with Child Protective Services Texas Department of Family and Protective Services DFPS, and that there'd been reports they needed to investigate. Investigate what I thought. I'll tell you what we had no idea. No warnings, no prior phone calls. Just this woman standing in our living room, eyes scanning the pastel jungle gym of plush dinosaurs and board books barely sparing a glance for the pile of medical records I had printed out on the counter. I slid the records across the granite. This is his pediatrician's report, clean bill of health 2 weeks ago. Developmental milestones all on track. Please look at the facts. She flipped through pages without reading. "I need to see the baby," she said. Anna swallowed voice small and led the way into the nursery, where Mateo sat in his crib, clutching a miniature wooden music box, our gift from Grandma Rodriguez back in Houston, the one that plays Brahms's Lullaby on a perpetual loop. I watched as CPS leaned over all professional distance, as though she were inspecting a stray cat, rather than someone's precious firstborn. Then she left, handing us a leaflet, "Supervised visitation, only court order attached." I stared at the paperwork. No judge's signature, no hearing date, just the terse line, "Temporary removal of child for further investigation." That night, under the dim glow of a single lamp, Anna and I sat on the couch, clutching that music box and a frantic prayer. Our son was in the hands of strangers. We had 10 days until our first hearing, and I felt the world compress into a single unbearable point. Either we convinced someone, anyone in the system, to look at the truth, or we risked losing him forever. The music box's fragile lullaby, once a comfort, now sounded like a siren, beautiful, haunting, and impossible to ignore. I knew anger alone wouldn't propel us through the legal labyrinth ahead. I needed evidence, concrete, undeniable proof that the allegations were false. First, I pored over call logs. Someone connected to CPS had flagged our case after only an hour-long supervised visit 2 summers ago, when Anna's mother, Susan Lee, volunteered to babysit. Susan is a CPS caseworker herself, a career bureaucrat whose motives we never questioned until we saw the first court notice. Her calls had escalated from, "I'm concerned about his weight," to possible neglect, to suspected substance use by mother. I'd asked Susan point blank in one tense phone conversation, "You've barely spent an hour with him." How do you know? Her response was icy. "I know enough. Enough to ruin our lives." That realization fueled my next move. I hired our old roommate Mark, half YouTuber, half hacker, but all heart, to comb through public records, security camera footage, anything that placed Susan at odd hours, outside the daycare, or school board meetings where she wasn't invited. Mark unearthed home security clips from our neighbor 2 doors down, Susan pacing our sidewalk at dawn, phone to her ear, her voice taut with purpose. He found online chatter in a local moms group, where people whispered that Susan bragged she knew how to run CPS from the inside and that nobody could stop her. With every file we collected, timestamps, call transcripts, the neighbor's video, our dossier grew heavier, but so did our resolve. Meanwhile, Anna found her courage in the least expected form: a battered baby sock, the one we'd placed in a keepsake box on our mantel. It was the sock pinned to our front door by CPS, an official act of terror, that said, "We can take your child at will." She wore the sock around her neck on a simple cord like a talisman, reminding herself daily that fear could not dictate our actions. That sock became the symbol of our struggle, our tiny flag of resistance, and I began telling myself, if they can intimidate you with one sock, show them how many socks you can collect by standing your ground. With our evidence in hand, we sued to expedite the hearing. Our public defender, Courtney Ningwin, wonderful person, but strapped with a mountain of cases, told us the system favored the state. These investigations take months, she warned. So I took the fight public. I booked the local community center, ran flyers across coffee shops, and invited neighbors to a live-stream town hall. Anna stood beside me, clutching the music box, her voice clear as she recounted long nights of trying to console a crying baby she couldn't hold. I presented every piece of evidence, the neighbor's video, Susan's own admissions audio recordings I'd coaxed from another relative, and the medical records proving Anna's sobriety, her mental health, our impeccable parenting track record. Halfway through Q&A, the room went silent as a man stood from the back row, Officer Jenkins, a CPS worker. He cleared his throat and said I was on the case. I was told to ignore the pediatrician's notes, to trust only Susan Lee's professional input. I thought it was procedure. I didn't know it was personal. Jenkins produced an internal memo, former CPS staff input, to be prioritized without verification. It was on official letterhead signed by Susan herself at the bottom. The room exploded. People gasped. Cameras flashed. For the first time, I saw the power of shining a spotlight on hidden schemes. That night, our video went viral. Local news anchors ran the story. State legislators called wanting details. Law professors emailed asking for transcripts. Even the CPS director issued a statement promising an internal review. But the celebration was short-lived. 2 days later, an unmarked black envelope arrived at our door. Inside a single sheet, cease and desist all public commentary or face punitive damages and defamation suits. Travis County CPS Legal Affairs. No judge's signature, no letterhead, just a threat penned by the very office tasked with protecting children. They were weaponizing the law against us, daring us to roll over. I folded the paper, anger coursing through me like acid. You think you can scare me, I thought. You think a threat from a legal department will silence a father whose child you kidnapped? I mounted a public response, a live stream on our front porch. Me in jeans and a t-shirt. Anna behind me with the sock and the music box on the small table between us. I explained the threat, waved the letter, and proclaimed, "We will not be intimidated. If CPS wants to sue me for defamation, I'll see them in court, and I have the evidence to prove every damn word I've said." The comments lit up with support, and I felt the seed of real power when you refuse to hide injustice trembles. The following morning, I filed subpoenas to unseal CPS's internal legal memos and to identify every staffer involved in drafting that threat letter. I also moved for summary judgment on the defamation claim, confident that courts hate being used as tools of intimidation. Then I went to Anna's school, dropped off homemade cookies, and thanked her principal, Ms. Rodriguez, for rallying the PTA. Word had spread among parents. Their kids were learning that government wasn't infallible, that citizen action could spur accountability. That afternoon, I met with our attorney to outline a civil rights complaint against Susan Lee, naming her and the anonymous network she'd built inside CPS. It would allege abuse of state power conspiracy to commit malicious prosecution and violations of the Texas Deceptive Trade Practices Act, because abusing a public office to harm private citizens counts as deception. The lawsuit would ask for damages, injunctive relief to remove Susan from CPS permanently, and disciplinary referrals to the state bar. My attorney, a fierce litigator named Karen Burke, nodded with urgency. "We file this tomorrow morning," she said. "We make clear that no one, no matter how well connected, can hijack CPS without consequences." That evening, I waited outside the courthouse for Karen holding Mateo in his car seat, the music box in one hand, the sock draped around my neck. The sky was pink with sunset stripes, but I felt only a steady focus. Tomorrow our suit would land like a thunderbolt. Tomorrow the paper promise of protection would meet the hardened ink of accountability. And tomorrow, the silent war that began with a knock at the door would move into the bright light of day. I looked down at Mateo, his tiny hand curled around the music box's crown, and realized the truth. I'd learned fear is a powerful weapon, but love is an unbreakable shield. As the courthouse doors slid open behind me, I took a breath, squared my shoulders, and stepped forward into whatever came next. The morning after we filed our civil rights complaint against Susan Lee and her shadow network at CPS, I woke with a nervous flutter in my chest, equal parts anticipation and dread. Outside, the world moved on: joggers on the sidewalk, school buses lumbering past our door, a neighbor's dog yapping at the mailman. But for Anna and me, time was both enemy and ally. We knew that in the days ahead, every motion, every hearing, every press mention would carry the weight of our son's future. I slid my feet into worn sneakers, grabbed a granola bar, and headed to the courthouse at 7:30 a.m. Court filings had lined up overnight. Our defamation motion subpoenas for CPS's internal legal memos and the newly drafted civil rights lawsuit under the Texas Deceptive Trade Practices Act. Karen Burke. My attorney expected me in her office at 8 hours to prepare our arguments for that afternoon's motion hearing. I parked in the underground lot, the leather seats of my car still warm from yesterday's sun, and took a moment to steel myself. This wasn't some corporate merger. This was a high-stakes battle against an institution gone rogue. A battle that would be fought not merely in legal briefs, but in the court of public opinion, in hushed legislative committee rooms, and most importantly, in every parent's mind who believed their child could be next. At Karen's downtown office, she greeted me with a firm handshake and a stack of papers. "We've got a busy day," she said, eyes bright. First up, our motion to unseal the CPS legal memos that outline their thumbscrew plan. Then our motion to dismiss the defamation threat letter on summary judgment grounds. Finally, the civil rights complaint filing. Her tone was crisp, but I could sense the long hours she'd poured into this already. We sat at her conference table, Kleenex packets, water bottles, and a stray baby sock pin from Anna's necklace, and drilled through mock arguments. She was relentless. Judge Alvarez doesn't suffer fools. She values precedent, but respects facts. In your unsealing motion, emphasize the public's right to know when child welfare resources are diverted into intimidation. In summary judgment, cite Hawkins v. State Bar. No one can use defamation suits as a gag order. I nodded, scribbling notes. By mid-morning, the courthouse hallways buzzed with lawyer chatter, briefcases, clicking heels tapping the hum of photocopiers. I spotted Susan Lee's attorney, McKinnon, in a crisp gray suit flanked by 2 CPS counsel in identical navy blazers. They walked with that predatory grace as if they'd already claimed victory. I met their eyes briefly. They offered no hint of remorse, only the faint curve of a smirk. That smirk fueled me. They had underestimated us once, and now they'd face consequences. Our first hearing was on the unsealing motion scheduled for 1:30 p.m. I grabbed a quick salad at a cafe across the street. No time to savor, and made my way to courtroom 4B. Judge Alvarez sat at the bench presiding with an aura of Midwestern fairness. Her gaze flicked over files before looking up at the bar. "Please proceed, Ms. Burke." Karen rose, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. She opened with our public interest argument. "Your Honor, the documents CPS seeks to keep secret are the foundation of allegations that officials diverted public resources into a personal vendetta. Under Texas Rule 76A, any record used in judicial proceedings is presumptively open unless the harm of disclosure outweighs the presumption. Here, the harm of secrecy, continued intimidation of citizens, and erosion of trust far exceeds any personnel privacy interests." CPS's counsel countered, voice measured. "Your Honor, these are internal memoranda containing sensitive personnel information. We do not dispute the public interest, but we must protect caseworker privacy and the integrity of ongoing investigations." Judge Alvarez listened, pen poised. Then she turned to me. "Mr. Johnson, do you wish to add anything?" I stood, feeling the uniform weight of my purpose. "Your Honor." "I hold in my hands one of those binders," I said, lifting the tattered folder embossed with Operation Thumbscrew in crisp type. The courtroom murmured. Inside are email chains instructing CPS staff to prioritize Susan Lee's allegations without verification and to deploy legal threats against private citizens exercising their rights. These documents reveal not just personnel matters, but a misuse of state power. The very branch of government charged with protecting children became a weapon against parents. If the court keeps these records sealed, it condones that weaponization. The judge nodded, and after brief deliberation, she granted our motion in full. The court recognizes the compelling public interest. CPS shall produce all relevant legal memos and personnel emails by Friday at noon. A flush of relief warmed me, but I knew the real battle was just beginning. Once unsealed, those memos would hit the press and the legislature with the force of avalanche. But CPS would fight every redaction, every footnote. We'd have to stay vigilant. Next came the defamation motion at 3:30 p.m. CPS's lawyers had filed suit based on the cease and desist letter claiming our public statements were false and defamatory. Karen argued for summary judgment. Your Honor, defamation under Texas law requires false statements presented as facts. Here, Mr. Johnson's statements are supported by verifiable evidence, timestamps, audio recordings, and CPS internal documents. Even if there were any protected opinions, Texas law shields expressions of public concern. This suit is a classic slap strategic lawsuit against public participation, and it should be dismissed under the anti-slap statute to protect free speech. CPS's counsel tried to muddy the water, claiming our statements implied criminal conduct not proven in court, but Karen dismantled each assertion with exhibit after exhibit. Judge Alvarez again ruled in our favor. This court values free speech and the public's right to critique government action. The defamation suit is hereby dismissed with prejudice. Another victory, but by filing the suit, CPS had forced us to waste time and money proving our right to speak. At 4:30 p.m., in a small filing window off the courthouse lobby, Karen handed me bound copies of our civil rights complaint claims for malicious prosecution, conspiracy to commit abuse of official capacity, and statutory relief under the Texas Deceptive Trade Practices Act. The cover page listed my name as plaintiff and Susan Lee McKinnon's firm and CPS Legal Affairs as defendants. I signed a final certification under penalty of perjury. Every fact stated was true to the best of my knowledge. Holding that complaint felt surreal. Once filed, the suit would trigger official investigations, potential sanctions, and the formal unmasking of who stood behind the threats and who would pay the price. Back at home, Anna and Mateo waited in the living room, the baby sock and music box gleaming under the soft lamplight. I sank onto the couch, exhausted but exhilarated. Anna at once wrapped her arms around me, kissing my temple and whispering, "You did it!" I closed my eyes, letting the adrenaline ebb. We sat in silence for a moment, our son gurgling between us, feeding from his milk bottle. Then I told Anna how Judge Alvarez had granted both motions and how the complaint was officially filed. "It's not over," I said, running a hand through my hair, "but we've broken their grip." That night, we hosted a small gathering of supporters in our courtyard. One string of solar lights, a pile of folding chairs, and a cooler filled with cold sodas. Neighbors' friends from Anna's school, Mark and even Officer Jenkins showed up. We raised our cups in a toast. To transparency, to accountability, to every parent who refuses to be silenced, I said. The assembled faces glowed with candles and hope. Someone started playing an acoustic guitar, singing a soft melody, and the music box was passed around each guest, winding it and letting the lullaby flow. It felt like a small communal ritual, healing through solidarity. But as the evening wound down and goodbyes were said, I remembered the broader stakes. CPS headquarters was already issuing press releases, calling our case an isolated incident, promising to root out the bad actors while praising 99% of their staff. The next morning, the local paper ran a story headlined, "Parent vs. CPS, an unlikely battle for transparency," complete with quotes from CPS Director Hastings, who maintained she'd taken swift action. The article buried mention of our unsealing victory and defamation dismissal deep in paragraph 12. This was government spin and action control the narrative by controlling the facts they highlight. Determined, I drafted a letter to the editor laying out the key revelations, the thumbscrew memos, the legal threats, and the judge's explicit backing for transparency. I called for ongoing public oversight, urging readers to request full unredacted memos under the Texas Public Information Act once released. I emailed the draft to Anna for edits. She tightened my tone, adding an appeal to ordinary Texans. If you believe government should serve the public, not punish parents, tell your representatives to hold CPS accountable. The letter went out that night. Over the next 2 days, our front porch live streams continued. I sat before my array of evidence fielding questions on camera. Why does CPS think they can intimidate citizens? What reforms will prevent this in the future? How do we ensure that the unsealed documents translate into real change? Comments rolled in with links to our letter to the editor directives for how to file PIA requests, and hosts offering pro bono legal assistance to families with similar cases. On Wednesday evening, at a local civic luncheon hosted by the League of Women Voters, I presented our case to a crowd of 200, an interactive slideshow illustrating how Susan Lee's insider network exploited CPS's procedures, how our motions had pierced secrecy, and how our civil suit sought structural accountability. I distributed flyers summarizing the CPS Transparency Act draft, urging attendees to lobby their representatives to support it. The room erupted in applause at the end, women and men marching toward the exits to pen letters and schedule meetings with their legislators. That night, we watched the first batch of unsealed memos arrive via secured Dropbox. 300 pages detailing Susan's strategic calls to CPS supervisors, budget allocations for external counsel labeled SLAP response, and internal directives to maintain plausible deniability. I pored through every line, marking names, dates, and references. Karen began preparing motions to compel CPS to produce witness testimony under oath. I called Officer Jenkins and asked him to come forward as a whistleblower. He agreed, fearful but resolute. By Thursday, the binders had swelled beyond the originals, now augmented with deposition transcripts, additional emails, and Jenkins's witness statement. We organized a media briefing at the Travis County DA's office, where 1,000 words on paper gave way to voices and faces on camera, Miana with Mateo asleep in her arms, Jenkins in suit and tie, Karen standing beside us. We laid out the case against Susan Lee, pressed the DA to launch criminal inquiries, and reiterated our call for the CPS Transparency Act. News crews captured every moment. That evening, multiple outlets ran front-page headlines: CPS Insider Network exposed parents, lawsuit, unmasks. Agency corruption, brave staffer tells all. Our momentum surged, yet as I lay in bed that night, scrolling through the avalanche of coverage, a sliver of dread crept in. CPS would retaliate again. Maybe through stalled reforms, maybe through random audits of our home daycare license, maybe by targeting other families. The legal victories felt monumental, but the real test lay ahead, translating them into permanent institutional change. I grasped Anna's hand in the dark eyes on the ceiling light. "Tomorrow we keep fighting," I whispered. She squeezed my fingers. "Together," she said, and as sleep finally took me, weighted with exhaustion, yet buoyed by purpose, I knew that our family's ordeal had unleashed a force no threat letter or legal maneuver could stop. Our narrative was no longer ours alone. It belonged to every parent who believed in a system capable of reform. The next chapter awaited us in courtrooms and legislative chambers. And while the path would remain perilous, one truth guided me: when citizens refuse to bow to intimidation, they become the architects of justice itself. Monday morning greeted me with overcast skies and a sense of mounting urgency. We'd won 2 critical motions, unsealing the CPS legal memos and defeating their defamation suit. But the real work lay ahead, translating our courtroom victories into lasting policy change, ensuring CPS couldn't simply regroup and reassert its power. I stepped outside with a thermos of coffee, the baby sock tied around its handle like a talisman, and hustled toward the legislative district office of Representative Lin Nguyen. Today, we needed to finalize the CPS Transparency Act language line by line and secure co-sponsors in both the State House and Senate. I arrived at the office to find Nguyen already poring over our latest draft highlighters strewn across her desk. Her aide Jenna waved me in. We've got Representatives Bell Martinez and even Baxter tentatively on board if we firm up the whistleblower protections and funding mechanisms today. I exchanged a quick fist bump with Nguyen. "Let's get to it." We settled around the conference table, Nguyen on one end, me on the other. Karen Burke and Mark flanking us with laptops and Jenna on notes. First up, whistleblower language. We wanted to ensure that any CPS employee who reported insider misconduct would be protected not just from firing, but from any adverse employment action, including demotion, pay reduction, or forced leave. Karen suggested adding a private right of action whistleblowers could sue if retaliation occurred with statutory damages. Gwen tapped her pen. That'll strengthen the teeth, she agreed, but Belle raised a flag. Civil suits could flood the courts, even with fee shifting. Can we add a requirement that whistleblowers pursue an internal remedy before filing civil action? We debated a mediation step, but worried it would stall protections. Ultimately, we wrote in a 90-day window, internal investigation, first, then civil suit if the agency failed to act. Next, funding. The Senate finance tweak had freed $9.2 million by slimming external counsel budgets. The House Appropriations Committee needed that detail spelled out. Karen drafted language to reallocate no less than 80% of external legal contingency funds to the IGO, with explicit reporting requirements to the Legislative Budget Board. Martinez's office wanted to ensure no new taxes or levies, so we clarified funds shall come exclusively from existing CPS legal accounts. Jenna nodded approvingly. This should satisfy fiscal conservatives. We moved on to the Independent Inspector General's scope. The Senate version gave the IGO subpoena power over CPS records and personnel. The House wanted oversight limits to prevent abuse. We compromised the IGO would need a 2/3 vote of a bipartisan oversight council, composed of the Attorney General, the state auditor, and 2 lawmakers from each party, to authorize subpoenas beyond standard reviews. It added checks against rogue investigations. By late morning, the revised act was nearly shape-shifting into law. We added final provisions, mandatory annual public hearings, transparency portals for CPS budgets, and criminal penalties for any CPS official who knowingly suppressed whistleblower reports and then typed end of draft in bold at the bottom of page 37. Gwen printed the draft and handed it to me. We're ready to roll this out in committee this Thursday. I exhaled, heart-pounding. We'd climbed a mountain and only the final summit remained. That afternoon, I met with Officer Jenkins at a small cafe near the Capitol. I slid him a copy of the draft act highlighting the whistleblower protections. I want to testify in the committee, he said, voice low but resolute. I can speak to the memo I received, how I was ordered to ignore pediatrician records. I nodded. Your testimony could sway fence-sitters who doubt insider misconduct occurred. He sipped his coffee. I'm nervous my colleagues will turn on me. I placed a hand on his shoulder. You'll have immunity under the new law, and you'll have us behind you. He squared his shoulders, the weight of his decision clear in his eyes, solidarity over self-preservation. Back at home, we held a late-night strategy session in the living room. Kansas City jazz spilled from a small speaker as Karen, Mark, Anna, and I planned the legislative push, tabling public hearings, scheduling expert witnesses, child psychologists, former CPS directors, legal scholars, all ready to testify. Anna rotated the music box's handle, its lullaby echoing through the room. This is our final volley, she said softly. We nail the bill in committee, then march it through the floor votes. I squeezed her hand. We do it together. Wednesday arrived with sweeping rain drumming on the windows as if to underscore the stakes. I spent the morning drafting op-eds, one for the Austin American-Statesman on how the unsealed memos exposed a culture of fear inside CPS, and another for the Texas Tribune, outlining how the Transparency Act would restore public trust. By noon, I emailed them to editors, then hopped a train to San Antonio for a televised debate with CPS officials. The show Your Texas pitted me against CPS Deputy Director Sandra Vargas. Under bright studio lights, Vargas defended CPS's response. We've already removed those responsible implemented reforms and are committed to transparency. I replied, Director Hastings' verbal promises aren't enough. We need codified protections to prevent a single supervisor from weaponizing the system again. That's why the Transparency Act is critical. The host, a sharp-eyed journalist, pressed Vargas, can you guarantee whistleblowers protection without legislation? Vargas hesitated. Our policy says, she trailed off. I seized the moment. Policy can change at will. Only law is binding. Texans know policy violations require law to hold agencies accountable. The live audience applauded. My heart raced. Public sentiment was tipping further in our favor. Thursday morning, the House Human Services Committee, convened in room H2.031. My binders heavy with redacted and unredacted memos awaited me. Advocacy groups filled the benches behind me. A line of CPS staffers sat to the side, their expressions guarded. When Rep. Gwen introduced the act, she ended with, "We call forward our first witness, Mr. David Johnson." Standing at the lectern, I began, "Thank you, Chair and committee members." Yesterday, the Travis County District Court unsealed CPS legal memos outlining how insiders orchestrated Operation Thumbscrew, a deliberate plan to weaponize child protection resources against an innocent family. These documents reveal a systemic failure and a profound abuse of trust. The Transparency Act addresses these failings by instituting an independent inspector general, robust whistleblower protections, and civil remedies for victims of abuse. I clicked through slides showing the memos' key passages, the call logs, and the thumbscrew title page. The sock pinned to my door splashed across the screen as a symbol of terror. The room was silent as I finished, then erupted in questions. How do we prevent frivolous suits? Why not expand the state auditor's authority instead of creating a new office? What budget impact can we realistically sustain? I fielded each pointing to fee-shifting clauses, explaining the IGO's need for independence, and citing the $9.2 million reallocation as fiscally neutral. Each answer drew nods. Then Officer Jenkins took the stand. His voice trembled. I worked at the CPS hotline. I saw Susan Lee's calls come through, concerns about weight, then neglect, then substance abuse allegations. On March 5th, I received an email from my supervisor. Prioritize Ms. Lee's reports. Do not escalate to pediatrician reviews. I felt uneasy, but I followed orders. Until I saw the court order taking a baby. He paused, head bowed. I realized the system had been perverted. A hush. Jenkins's courage palpable. The committee chair, Rep. Garcia, leaned forward. Thank you for your service and honesty. Your story underscores the need for our bill. CPS Deputy Director Vargas was next her chance to defend the agency. But pressed on why Jenkins's hotline instruction had gone uninvestigated, she stumbled. We are reviewing internal processes, she said. I caught her eye policy lip service lacking specifics. When she sat, buzz filled the room. Gwen immediately asked members for a vote on Amendment D, clarifying whistleblower immunity and codifying the IGO's budget, and then for final passage. The roll call vote was unanimous, 11-0. Committee approval. Applause. Relief broke through me like sunlight after a storm. I emerged into the hallway, the Memphis rain pounding the windows. Reporters and advocacy groups swarmed. I answered cameras. This is proof that accountability can work in Texas. We've shown that when citizens speak truth to power, the system bends toward justice. Phones buzzed with congratulatory texts, but minutes later, a grim update arrived. CPS had quietly sent an emergency rulemaking proposal to the Texas Register seeking to formally define internal legal affairs as exempt from Public Information Act requests, effectively codifying secrecy for certain memos. My stomach tightened. Our legal wins could be undercut by administrative sleight of hand. I hacked out a quick plan. Karen would file a PIA objection, and I would draft an emergency letter to the Secretary of State demanding a public comment hearing on the rulemaking. I dashed to my car, phone in hand, drafting objections between red lights. The afternoon became a blur, filing PIA objections, huddling with Karen at her office, sending letters to the governor's office demanding a veto of the rule exemption, and coordinating with news outlets for coverage. By late evening, the CPS rulemaking was on every news site. CPS seeks to shield internal memo from public view headlines screamed. Op-eds denounced the effort as cynical and dangerous. Our coalition mobilized letters poured into the Secretary of State. Public meetings were called, and legislators raised questions on the floor. The moral outrage eclipsed that morning's committee victory. I realized winning votes was only part of the battle. Maintaining transparency required perpetual vigilance. That night, I returned home drenched from the rain, the binders in a plastic tote bag on the passenger seat. Anna greeted me looking tired but determined. You did it in committee, she said, handing me a towel. I nodded, shrugging the wet coat. But they're trying to rewrite the rules now. She set Mateo down, and as he crawled toward us, I felt a renewed surge of purpose. "Then we fight the rulemaking next," I said, pulling Anna close. We sat with the music box playing softly between us, a lullaby for a baby, but also for our battered resolve. The baby sock lay on the mantel like a silent oath our family had survived the first onslaught. But a bureaucratic counterattack loomed. I closed my eyes, letting the lullaby wash over me as I planned our next moves. Public hearings, legislative challenges, possible litigation under the Administrative Procedure Act. And as I drifted to sleep, the last strains of Brahms' lullaby ringing, I whispered to the dark, "We protect this law or it's meaningless." No one intimidates Texas parents twice. The first rays of dawn had barely brushed the rooftops when I rolled out of bed, my mind racing faster than my heartbeat. The wind rattled the window panes as I glanced at the stack of binders on the kitchen table, now 17 pounds of evidence detailing CPS's internal thumbscrew strategy, Susan Lee's clandestine network, and the legal threats they'd filed against our family. Yesterday's triumphant committee vote in the House Human Services Committee had filled me with hope. Today, we faced a second front CPS's attempt to rewrite rulemaking to exempt their internal legal affairs from public records requests. If they succeeded, even our newly unsealed memos could vanish into bureaucratic black holes. That meant our legislative victory was unfinished business. I poured a cup of coffee, kissed Anna and Mateo goodbye, and headed into the gray morning drizzle, with one thought repeating in my mind: this fight never stops. Securing public commentary on CPS rulemaking. My first stop was the State Library and Archives Commission, where I planned to file an objection to the Texas Register notice announcing CPS's proposed rule. Under the Administrative Procedure Act, any citizen can demand a public comment hearing on agency rules. I arrived just as the building opened, breathing deep lungfuls of crisp air to calm my nerves. The clerk took my filing a succinct 8-page objection and stamped it, received July 14, 2025. I couldn't help but feel a small surge of victory. By law, CPS would now have to hold a hearing and respond to our objections. Their gambit to seal memos behind a rule could now be challenged in a public forum. As I left, I dialed Rep. Lynn Nguyen's office. Jenna picked up. "We got your filing. We'll officially request a public hearing in the state capitol, ideally next week. We can hold it in the same committee room where we passed the Human Services Bill." I exhaled, vision clearing. "Good. Let's schedule it publicly so media and advocates can attend." With that logistical hurdle cleared, I moved on to the next battlefield, rallying the media and public support. I spent the rest of the morning drafting a press advisory. CPS attempts to shield thumbscrew memos by rulemaking citizens demand transparency. Hearing, I sent it to every major media outlet in Texas: Austin, American Statesman, Dallas Morning News, Houston Chronicle, and several statewide radio networks. Within minutes, reporters responded with questions. Where would the hearing be? What exactly was the agency hiding? I forwarded them the link to our redacted memos on a secure site and offered interviews. By midday, news alerts popped up across smartphones statewide. CPS under fire for secret rulemaking. Parent-led coalition demands hearing on child protection secrecy. Will CPS be held accountable? The momentum was building. Meanwhile, I posted detailed instructions on how ordinary Texans could file their own objections via the Texas Secretary of State's e-rules portal. I live-streamed from my front porch, baby sock pinned to my shirt, walking viewers through each step. Comments flooded in, just filed. "Thank you for the tutorial. CPS cannot hide from the people." I paused to watch Mateo crawl across the porch toward me, squealing. That little face reminded me why I fought not just for us, but for every child whose well-being is entrusted to CPS. I signed off the live stream, heart pounding with gratitude and determination. Preparing for the public hearing, by midweek, the state capitol had confirmed the public hearing Wednesday, July 22, 2025, at 9:00 a.m., room E2.0, the same room where I'd testified in committee. I rallied our coalition legal aid clinics, child advocacy nonprofits, union representatives, faith groups, and concerned parents. We organized transportation, prepared talking points, and arranged childcare for those who needed it. Karen Burke drafted our formal testimony. Each of us allotted 3 minutes, me presenting the legal memo excerpts, Officer Jenkins recounting his orders to ignore the pediatrician, and Dr. Maria Santos, an expert in child welfare, speaking to how secrecy undermines trust. We rehearsed our statements until our voices were hoarse, mindful that every word could reverberate through both the hearing and the media. The evening before, Anna hosted a small gathering at our house for those traveling from out of town. We grilled vegetables, passed out fruit-infused water, and aired our last-minute nerves. A CPS whistleblower advisory group arrived with printed flyers and business card-sized guides on whistleblower protections under the new bill. They said in hushed, determined voices, "This law won't just die in the pages of Texas statutes. We're going to enforce it." Their confidence buoyed me. This wasn't just our fight. It was a collective pact. The public hearing. At 7:30 a.m. on Wednesday, I arrived at the Capitol, greeted by gray skies and a line of supporters stretching down the marble hallway. Teenagers from Anna's school held posters reading "Transparency equals safety" and "Protect children, not secrets." The energy was electric. I shook hands, signed autographs, and posed for a quick photo with a local high school newspaper reporter. Justice, I realized, felt communal. It was a movement, not a solo performance. Room E2.012 filled rapidly. Seats were at a premium. Some attendees stood against the walls. Cameras and microphones dotted the benches, ready to capture every syllable. CPS legal counsel sat at a table off to one side, faces impassive. The hearing began with a formal roll call of agencies and citizens invited to speak. Chairman Evans, who presided over the committee, tested the gavel and called the room to order. Today, we convene a public comment hearing on proposed amendments to Title 40, Chapter 745, Subchapter B, Section 745.3 of the Texas Administrative Code pertaining to CPS legal affairs exemptions, he intoned. A clerk read the rule text, an intricate web of definitions and justifications purporting to shield internal correspondence. The room nearly dozed off until Chairman Evans said, "We will open the floor to public comment." I rose, feeling the eyes of dozens of cameras turned to me. Chairman Evans, members of the commission. I am David Johnson, plaintiff in Johnson v. CPS Legal Affairs, and a father whose son was wrongfully removed, based on insider false allegations. I stand before you today not to vilify every CPS employee, but to demand transparency where it is most needed. These proposed exemptions would allow CPS to hide memos that reveal how caseworkers were instructed to bypass pediatric evaluations and legal oversight, instead prioritizing hearsay from a single insider. I ask you, do we want our child protection agency to operate in secret or under the watchful eye of the public they serve? I paused. The room was silent but for the hum of a far-off air conditioner. I urge you to reject these exemptions and preserve the public's right to know. Applause broke out in the back, a powerful start. Next up was Officer Jenkins. He stepped to the mic, clearing his throat. I was a hotline supervisor at CPS. In early 2024, I received written orders from Ms. Susan Lee, directing me to flag all future calls under my supervision as high priority without review. I complied out of fear of retaliation. As a result, innocent parents faced the terror of their children being removed. If CPS can exempt internal affairs from public disclosure, then no one can ever expose misconduct. His voice wavered, but he pressed on. Please don't let secrecy silence truth. The room erupted in supportive murmurs and a few discreet tears from audience members. Then Dr. Maria Santos, a pediatric psychologist, took the podium. She presented research on transparent accountability in child welfare systems worldwide, drawing correlations between secrecy and higher rates of abuse and wrongful removal. She spoke of children's trauma when parents vanish without warning, the emotional toll of uncertainty, and how public oversight can actually improve caseworker morale by building community trust. Her slides showed data from California and Pennsylvania where similar transparency measures led to a 25% reduction in wrongful investigations. By the time she concluded, even Chairman Evans leaned forward, nodding. A dozen other citizens spoke a social worker who'd lost her job after reporting questionable directives. Parents from Dallas, whose caseworkers threatened them with contempt, and nonprofit directors who detailed the difficulty of assisting families when so much was hidden by CPS. Each spoke from personal pain and conviction, weaving a tapestry of systemic urgency. When the final comment concluded, Chairman Evans asked CPS's Deputy Director, Sandra Vargas, to respond. Vargas's prepared remarks fell flat under the weight of the testimonies. She insisted the exemptions were standard practice to protect privacy, but her answers lacked specifics on how reporters, advocates, or legislators could request oversight. At one point, Vargas said, "We will continue to strive for greater transparency," prompting a collective groan from the audience that midwifed her walk off the stage. Chairman Evans then opened the floor for deliberation. The commissioners, now aware of the depth of concern, unanimously voted to reject the proposed exemptions. A court reporter called the vote 5-0 against. The gavel came down with finality. Jubilation erupted, cheers, applause, even tears. I hugged Gwen and Karen, and Officer Jenkins grinned wide. Our fight had forced CPS to back down, preserving the integrity of existing public records laws. It was a landmark moment. Texas would keep its watchful eyes on CPS legal affairs, cementing the human impact. That evening, as word of the hearing's outcome spread, I received messages from around the state, an out-of-work teacher from El Paso, who'd been too afraid to speak up, a foster parent from Waco, who'd watched the rulemaking in disbelief, and a handful of current CPS employees grateful for the transparency win. One message stood out from a woman who said her 6-year-old daughter had been wrongly taken the previous year, and her court hearing to reclaim him had been delayed for months because internal memos had been withheld. She thanked me for giving her hope that the next family facing injustice would have a fighting chance. I printed that email and slipped it into my journal alongside the baby sock and a photograph of Mateo asleep in Anna's arms. In that private moment, I realized our fight was bigger than legislation. It was about restoring faith in institutions that touch the most vulnerable among us. Laws and regulations matter, but without real human stories to animate them, they can become hollow, preparing for final floor votes. With the rulemaking blocked, our focus turned to the House and Senate floor votes on the CPS Transparency Act itself. The bill's second reading was scheduled in the House on Monday, with a final vote expected Tuesday. The Senate would then need to concur on House amendments next week. Time was short. We mobilized our coalition to flood legislators with calls and emails over the weekend, personal letters, form letters, and hand-delivered petitions from community centers across the state. I spent Saturday knocking on doors in my own neighborhood, urging neighbors to call their representatives. This is not a partisan issue. It's about protecting children and parents, about preserving justice. On Sunday morning, I met with Karen one last time to rehearse potential points of contention, enforcement clauses, sunset provisions, and the scope of civil remedies. We anticipated pushback from libertarian-leaning representatives worried about government overreach. Our response: transparency protects liberty by ensuring power is not abused. We crafted concise rebuttals for anticipated amendments should they surface to guarantee the bill emerged intact. By Sunday evening, my inbox overflowed with fundraising pledges to cover operational costs for advocacy ads, op-ed placements, and legal clinics ready to assist whistleblowers. I forwarded each to Anna, marveling at how a blog post and a live stream had galvanized such widespread support. Still at home, I sensed the pull of exhaustion and unshakable fatigue that wove into my bones. I lay in our bedroom, Anna curled beside me, her arms around my waist. Mateo slept in his crib, the familiar tinkle of the music box drifting down the hallway. I whispered, "Tomorrow is the vote into the darkness." She murmured, "We'll make it." The House floor vote. Monday morning broke clear and hot, typical for an East Texas summer. I arrived at the House chamber, early, the air conditioned to a chilly 68 degrees, a stark contrast to the heat outside, and the heat I felt in my veins. Banks of desks spread before me, each with a small voting console, and at the front, the speaker's rostrum. Gwen was already there, conferring with allies. Belle seated beside her, offering a nod. The gallery above the chamber was packed with supporters in branded Transparency for Texas CPS t-shirts, waving small socks on stick-handled signs. Their chants of transparency now echoed below, a living testament to grassroots power. When the clerk read the bill for a second time, the chamber fell silent. Speaker Watson recognized Nguyen to offer a brief floor speech. She recapped the emotional testimonies, the thumbscrew expose, and the rulemaking victory. She urged colleagues to preserve public trust by passing the act. Then the floor opened for debate. Rep. Baxter rose his Appropriations Committee chair credentials, earning respectful attention, and complimented the bill's financial neutrality. He explained how reallocating CPS legal funds would not affect child services budgets and commended the inclusion of checks to prevent frivolous lawsuits. His endorsement carried weight, dispelling budgetary fears. Rep. Moore, who had previously worried about litigation floods, spoke next. He admitted his concerns had been addressed by the anti-SLAPP measures and the internal mediation requirement. He described meeting parents who'd experienced wrongful removal, including the El Paso mother, whose email I'd forwarded. His voice cracked as he said, "No procedural worry outweighs a child's sense of security with their family." That personal testimony turned heads. The last speaker was a libertarian Republican who warned against mission creep and argued that existing oversight might suffice. He closed, "I support government transparency, but we must trust professionals to do their jobs without micromanagement." I held my breath as he sat. Then Speaker Watson called for the vote. Red lights flickered on consoles. The clerk read the tally, 136-4 in favor. The chamber erupted in cheers. Representatives thumped desks, waved to the gallery, and some even mounted the dais to embrace Nguyen. My eyes stung with tears, another victory forged in shared conviction and relentless pressure. The Senate concurrence. Wednesday, 2 days later, the legislature reconvened in Austin's Texas Senate chamber for concurrence on the House amendments, chiefly the mediation requirement and the bipartisan council for IGO subpoenas. The Senate, more conservative and tradition-bound, required sensitive handling. I rode the elevator up with Senator Martinez, who'd shifted from initial skeptic to bill sponsor after seeing our committee testimony. We exchanged a quick handshake. "We closed this down today," he assured me. Inside the chamber, senators took their seats under the carved wooden ceiling that had stood since Reconstruction. When the amendments were read, Martinez gave his floor speech emphasizing that these tweaks strengthened balance and independence. The gallery's sock-waving supporters offered muted applause, knowing the Senate demands decorum. After brief debate, primarily Senator Howard pointing out that mediation could slow judicial relief, Martinez and Nguyen convinced him to withdraw his reservations. Then the vote 27-1 in favor. Senator Howard was the lone no. But Nguyen pointed out he had explained his vote and voted to allow reconsideration if implementation faltered. With Senate concurrence complete, the Speaker of the House and Lieutenant Governor signed off, and the bill was enrolled for delivery to Governor Abbott. At 5:00 p.m., Nguyen and I stood on the south steps of the Capitol as photographers clicked. We held a framed copy of the signed bill, now law, on its way to the governor's desk. "This is for all Texans," Nguyen said. I added, "and for every child who deserves a system that protects, not prosecutes families." Awaiting the governor's signature. The final hurdle lay at the governor's desk. Under Texas law, Governor Abbott had 20 days to sign or veto. The legislative session ended July 30th, and any unsigned bills would automatically become law. Our coalition lobbied the governor's office, emails, calls, small delegations, led by faith leaders and child welfare advocates. On July 29th, the state's official portal updated. Governor Abbott signs HB 2025 CPS Transparency Act, effective September 1st, 2025. I was in the airport en route to a legal conference when the notification pinged. I nearly dropped my carry-on. A flurry of text messages confirmed our law would live. I called Anna midair, and she screamed with joy. "We did it!" she said, tears crackling in her voice. I closed my eyes, imagining our living room back home, the music box winding the sock tacked to the wall, and the framed act shining under the lamp. A new chapter. Implementation and vigilance, signing HB 2025 into law, was a monumental victory, but it marked the beginning of a new phase implementation. Over the next month, I served on a stakeholder advisory council convened by the Department of Family and Protective Services, alongside the Auditor's Office and the Governor's policy advisors. We hammered out rules for IGO appointment, drafted whistleblower intake forms, and wrote civil suit guidelines. We met weekly in austere conference rooms, drafting regulations and stakeholder memos. At times, bureaucratic inertia and turf battles threatened to derail progress, but our coalition, armed with the moral authority granted by our legislative success, pushed through each delay. On September 1, 2025, the CPS Transparency Act took effect. The first Inspector General, Aisha Brooks, was sworn in with fanfare at the Capitol. A ceremony followed. Families whose children were affected by thumbscrew CPS whistleblowers, child welfare advocates, and legislators gathered to celebrate. I watched from the dais as Brooks spoke of her office's mission to safeguard children and support caseworkers. When she mentioned families like the Johnsons, I felt my chest tighten with pride and relief. That evening, back at home, Anna tucked Mateo into bed and wound the wooden music box one last time. We sat in the rocking chair together, holding hands. "We finally came full circle," she whispered. I kissed her forehead. "From fear to law, yes, we did." I looked at the sock pinned to the wall above the mantel, now a reminder of what we'd overcome, not what we feared. As the music box's last notes faded, I realized that this law, a product of citizen action, unwavering advocacy, and the rule of law, would stand as a bulwark against future abuses. But vigilance was eternal policies, needed enforcement budgets, needed oversight, and new threats would emerge. Yet I felt ready to face whatever came next, bolstered by the knowledge that a single family's resolve had reshaped an entire system for the better. And somewhere in that tapestry of triumph, I understood the ultimate truth: when individuals refuse to be silenced, they become the architects of justice. The autumn sun slanted low through the high maple trees lining our street as I headed back to the Travis County Courthouse, binders in hand and purpose in my stride. 2 months had passed since Governor Abbott signed the CPS Transparency Act into law, and the new Inspector General's office was humming to life. Audits were underway. Whistleblower claims logged, deputies trained. We'd protected the records we'd unsealed, and legislative reforms were transforming the agency's culture. But the fight was far from over. CPS had quietly appealed the district court's dismissal of its defamation suit, and our civil rights complaint, alleging malicious prosecution and abuse of official capacity, was set for trial in November. Meanwhile, the U.S. Department of Labor had just opened an ERISA-style inquiry into whether CPS misused public welfare statutes to retaliate against parents, an unprecedented federal action. My schedule snapped from the slow drip of legislative sessions to a torrent of courtroom dates, depositions, and regulatory hearings. Arriving at the courthouse, I braced for a marathon. Morning DOOI investigation debrief. At 8:30, I joined Agent Patel and Agent Rivera of the DOOL in a wood-paneled conference room on the 4th floor. They'd requested a follow-up after our initial deposition months earlier. I rounded the table to deliver Officer Jenkins's signed affidavit, labored over by Karen's legal team to adhere to federal evidentiary standards. Patel scanned the document's final page, Jenkins's admission that he'd been directed to bypass pediatrician records by Susan Lee and to fast-track her hotline reports. This confirms a coordinated effort to target specific families. Patel said, ticking boxes on his tablet. We're expanding our inquiry to include CPS higher-ups' potential misuse of Title IV funds and whether state officials knowingly permitted this misconduct. My chest tightened at the thought of CPS executives under federal scrutiny. It was both vindication and a humbling reminder of how deep the abuse ran. Rivera added, "We may call you back for a sworn hearing before the end of the month." I nodded. "I'll be ready." Mid-morning meeting with Inspector General from the DOL building. I dashed a few blocks to CPS headquarters, no longer a fortress of secrecy, but a sprawling campus now dotted with open recordees kiosks and transparency banners. Inspector General Aisha Brooks met me in her glass-walled office. We reviewed the latest whistleblower intake, 7 new claims alleging procedural pressure, and one claiming that a supervisor ghosted a mandated investigation after weeks of inaction. Brooks looked grim. These claims arrived within weeks of the act's effective date. That tells me there are more insiders afraid to come forward. She handed me a packaged binder internal training videos now under review for policy compliance. Our full audit report goes to the Legislative Budget Board next week. It'll show how CPS's old legal affairs budget shrank by 40% and how new funds were reallocated to frontline services. I ran my fingers over the binder's spine. That's a huge shift, I said. But we need to ensure those dollars translate into improved child welfare outcomes. Brooks nodded. That's the next phase, correlating budget reallocations with case closure rates, investigation timeframes, and family reunification metrics. I'd value your insights. For the first time, I felt we were in a genuine partnership, citizen architects and agency watchdogs collaborating to rebuild trust. Lunch rally with child welfare advocates. I grabbed a quick sandwich at a deli across the street, then hurried to a park pavilion where child welfare nonprofits had organized a midday rally. Parents of children touched by CPS former foster youth union reps and attorneys braved a chill breeze to hold up signs. Transparency saves lives, protect whistleblowers. I took the stage for a 10-minute address, the baby sock pinned to my lapel, and the music box perched on a nearby table. 2 months ago, we passed the most comprehensive CPS reform in state history I began. Today, we hold our agency accountable for delivering on that promise. We are not bystanders, we are guardians of our children's rights. I recounted the DOL inquiry and the IGO's audit, urging the crowd to submit their own feedback to the Inspector General. When I finished, applause rang out, echoing off the pavilion's columns. A dozen people handed me handwritten notes. My caseworker pressured me. No one listened to my concerns until now, data that would feed both the audit and media coverage. Afternoon civil rights trial preparation back at Karen's office. We spent the afternoon preparing for our upcoming civil rights trial. The complaint filed under Texas's Deceptive Trade Practices Act, and for malicious prosecution named Susan Lee, CPS Legal Affairs, and their counsel, McKinnon, as defendants. We had motions to file witness lists to finalize and trial exhibits to organize the unsealed memos, the hotline logs, the Instagram screenshots of Susan's bragging, Jenkins's testimony, Dr. Roth's pediatric records, and the DOL agent's affidavits. I reviewed direct examination scripts, practicing to speak with calm authority rather than raw rage. Karen coached me on pacing and emphasizing key facts. You're the architect of your own credibility. Let your authenticity speak. The jury will sense sincerity. Our paralegal arrived with a trial notebook 4 inches thick. We spent 2 hours cross-referencing exhibits to deposition testimony, ensuring no inconsistencies. By 5:00 p.m., our case was organized like a military operation. Exhausted but confident, I thanked Karen and headed home, the binders under my arm, feeling both familiar and foreboding. Evening, reconnecting at home. At home, the warm glow of the kitchen greeted me as Anna prepared dinner, lentil soup and garlic bread, my favorite. Mateo ran around clutching his music box. I sank into a chair. "How was your day?" Anna asked, handing me a bowl. I recounted the DOL briefing, the IGO meeting, the rally, and the trial prep. Her eyes widened. "That is an epic day," she said, hugging me. I paused, realizing how much she'd carried just by her smile and quiet support. "It's all for him," I said, gesturing to Mateo. He squealed and waved the music box at me. I laughed, scooping him into my lap. The weight of legal binders and political maneuvering fell away at the sight of his toothless grin. I promised him bedtime story Adventureland, tucked him in, and then sat with Anna over tea. We talked about the roller coaster of the last months, the horror of that first CPS knock, the terror of losing our son, the rush of legal victories, the legislative triumph, the unsealing the DOL inquiry, and now this approaching civil rights trial. "I never imagined we'd be here," Anna whispered. I took her hand. Neither did I. But if we'd let fear win, I'd be empty, not just scared. Instead, we're writing a new chapter, a law that outlasts us, a system that learns from its mistakes and justice that resonates beyond our family. She nodded, resting her head on my shoulder. Late night reviewing trial, witness lists. Long after Mateo slept and Anna drifted off, I sat at the dining table under a single lamp reviewing our witness list. Dr. Roth, Dr. Martinez. Officer Jenkins Olson, the daycare director. Our neighbor Harper, with the security footage, and an expert in state agency governance. Each witness added a layer of credibility, humanized the evidence, and bound it to a narrative the jury could grasp. I arranged their testimony order, thinking through transitions from medical facts to insider orders to emotional impact. I ran the sequence aloud, listening for logical gaps or stumbles. My voice raspy at 1:00 a.m. I finally packed up my notes and scrunchable highlighters, my shoulders heavy, but my purpose unwavering. A new dawn trial day approaches. By the time I crawled into bed, dawn's first pale light was seeping around the curtains. I set my alarm for 5:15 a.m., determined to meditate briefly before another grueling day. Sleep when it came was restless dreams of courtrooms morphing into CPS offices, hot gavel strikes, and music box lullabies echoing in empty halls. As the night gave way to morning, I lay there reflecting on the distance traveled from terrified parent pleading with a CPS worker to co-architect of sweeping legislative and judicial reforms. Our journey had fused personal anguish with systemic change. But the next chapter, the civil rights trial, would test every ounce of our preparation, every piece of evidence and every argument. Would a jury of 12 Texans see beyond the impersonal blue blazers of CPS to the parents whose lives were upended? Could they hold Susan Lee and her enablers accountable for weaponizing a child protective agency? I rose, stretched, and whispered a vow to the darkness. Today we bring justice full circle. The morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse skylight like spotlights on a new arena, illuminating the freshly polished walnut benches and the brass placards marking the witness stands. Today was the day our civil rights trial against Susan Lee and CPS Legal Affairs. A courtroom culmination of obsessive preparation, legislative victories, and personal sacrifice. As I sat in the empty gallery before the public arrived, I let the weight of that moment settle over me, the binders of Operation Thumbscrew, the baby sock pinned to my lapel, and the wooden music box nestled in a legal tote beside me. This trial would not just decide my family's fate. It could set the first judicial precedent in Texas for parental civil rights claims against government agencies that abuse their power. Opening statements. Framing the narrative. At 9:00 a.m., Judge Alvarez stepped into the courtroom. She acknowledged the attorneys, then invited our counsel, Karen Burke, to deliver the plaintiff's opening statement. Karen rose with quiet confidence, walking to the center of the courtroom. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we present a case of deliberate misuse of state power. In 2024, Susan Lee, a seasoned CPS caseworker, used her position to initiate false allegations against Anna and David Johnson, leading to the wrongful removal of their 8-month-old son, Mateo, for 5 agonizing months. She did so by orchestrating a campaign portions of which we have labeled Operation Thumbscrew, that prioritized her unverified reports over medical evidence, deployed legal threats to silence the parents, and manipulated agency resources for personal vendetta. We will prove through documentary evidence, whistleblower testimony, and expert analysis that CPS Legal Affairs conspired with Ms. Lee to violate the Johnsons' civil rights, causing irreparable harm. At trial's end, we will ask you to hold them accountable and award damages sufficient to deter this conduct in the future. Her words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown. Then CPS's attorney McKinnon delivered the defense's opening statement, portraying Susan as a caring professional who raised valid concerns, attributing any missteps to bureaucratic miscommunication. He urged the jury to trust the official record that CPS had acted in good faith based on the best interests of the child. His words were smooth, but the contrast with Karen's fierce clarity set the stage for an evidentiary showdown. Plaintiff's case, evidence and witnesses, and medical evidence and pediatric testimony. Dr. William Roth, the Johnsons' pediatrician, was first, a venerable clinician with silver hair and gentle eyes. He testified that in his 6-month checkup, he noted no signs of neglect or abuse. Mate's growth percentiles were within normal limits, and he recommended further monitoring for minor reflux, not removal from parental care. Roth explained that CPS's failure to consult his notes violated agency policy requiring confirmation from medical professionals. Dr. Roth's demeanor conveyed grave concern. It is devastating to see parents penalized when medical evidence is clear. His testimony established the first breach procedural safeguards that existed on paper but were ignored in practice. 2. Whistleblower admission officer Jenkins was next still in his late 20s in a dark suit that looked too formal for his unaccustomed role. Under direct examination, he delivered his statement with trembling conviction. When asked why he followed Susan Lee's orders, he replied, "Because I was afraid of losing my job. She was a senior specialist, and her word carried weight. My supervisors told me to prioritize her calls over everything else." His recounting of a written directive flag all calls from Ms. Lee as high priority and bypass medical record checks sent murmurs through the courtroom. Cross-examination by McKinnon attempted to portray Jenkins as an unreliable employee with performance issues. But Karen questioned with precision, drawing out the chain of custody email, metadata timestamps, and logs corroborated Jenkins's account. His testimony crystallized the conspiracy at the heart of the case. 3. Direct evidence. The thumbscrew memos. We introduced the unsealed CPS legal memos, hundreds of pages bound in neat folders. One memo titled, Operation Thumbscrew Johnson Response Plan outlined a 5-step process for escalating false allegations, managing media attention, and deploying legal threats. Prepare defamation suit if public commentary persists. The jury hovered over slides, zooming in on key phrases. Prioritize caseworkers' professional input. Suppress pediatric records. Use cease and desist letters to intimidate parents. Each phrase underscored premeditation and malice. McKinnon objected to the volume of documents, but Judge Alvarez overruled, citing their clear relevance. The visuals were stark government directives weaponized against citizens. 4. Expert testimony on civil rights violations. Der Eleanor Kim, a professor of constitutional law at UT Austin, testified on the legal standards for civil rights claims under Texas law. She explained that abusive use of state power to remove a child constitutes an actionable tort analogous to malicious prosecution because it violated the Johnsons' due process rights. State actors enjoy qualified immunity, but that immunity does not extend to willful misconduct or actions taken outside legal authority. She said, her voice resonant. Her legal analysis framed the jury's understanding. We weren't merely suing for negligence. We were seeking redress for intentional, unlawful deprivation of parental rights. 5. Financial hardship and emotional distress. Next, we presented the Johnsons' personal plight, financial statements showing months of medical bills for therapy, childcare expenses during supervised visits, and legal fees. Anna took the stand for an emotional account. The trauma of hearing Mateo cry behind a two-way mirror. Her descent into postpartum depression. Sleepless nights haunted by unknown threats. Threats that arrived via the letter CPS had sent. She held the baby sock, her voice quavering. It felt like they had robbed me of my identity as a mother. The courtroom was silent as she bowed her head. McKinnon's attempts to downplay her distress unraveled in the face of raw sincerity. The jury saw a mother's anguish, not a legal abstraction. Defense case attempted rebuttals. The defense called Susan Lee briefly, but her testimony was evasive. Under cross-examination by Karen, Susan faltered, denying awareness of Operation Thumbscrew despite her name on internal memos. She claimed she lacked authority to instruct hotline operations, an argument easily refuted by the same organizational chart she'd signed off. A brief testimony from a CPS compliance officer attempted to assert that any missteps were isolated mistakes corrected by subsequent policy updates, but we countered with a timeline showing systemic directives spanning 8 months too extensive for a mere error. The defense character witness of a former co-worker praising Susan's dedication could not counter the avalanche of documentary proof. Closing arguments, wrapping the fight. After a week of testimony, closing arguments began. Karen stood first, walking to the jury box, Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen the evidence: emails, memos, sworn affidavits, medical records, and personal testimony. You've seen how CPS insiders manipulated a government agency to punish a family for non-compliance with personal vendettas. This was not a good faith effort to protect a child. It was an orchestrated campaign to terrorize parents. Texas law demands accountability. When state power is abused, we ask you to vindicate the Johnsons, hold the defendants responsible, and deliver a verdict that sends a clear message: no one in public service can weaponize authority with impunity. McKinnon's rebuttal urged the jury to consider CPS's good intentions and policy reforms since the events. He framed our lawsuit as nuanced, punitive, and overshooting legitimate claims. He appealed to jurors' deference to state agencies, but his closing lacked the moral clarity of Karen's. The verdict: delivering justice. On a crisp Friday afternoon, after hours of jury deliberation, Judge Alvarez reconvened the court. Everyone rose as the jury filed in, four-person clutching the verdict form. My heart thundered as Karen and I stood beside the Johnsons. The four-person read: Count I, malicious prosecution verdict for plaintiff. Count 2, abuse of official capacity verdict for plaintiff. Count 3, Texas, deceptive trade practices verdict for plaintiff. Damages $1,000, $250,000 in compensatory damages, $500,000 in exemplary punitive damages. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Anna buried her face in her hands, tears of relief streaming. I clenched my fists, almost disbelieving. Justice had been rendered. Judge Alvarez smiled, noting the thoroughness of our proof. She reserved award of attorney's fees and costs, which we later quantified at another $350,000 borne by the defendants. Aftermath: implementation and vigilance. The verdict sent shockwaves through Texas. News headlines roared: CPS held liable for civil rights violations. Parent wins landmark case against state agency, and whistleblower reveals systemic abuse. The State Department of Family and Protective Services issued a rare apology promising to accelerate reforms beyond what the Transparency Act had mandated. Governor Abbott commended the unbiased judicial process and pledged to monitor CPS enforcement. The U.S. Department of Labor escalated its inquiry, announcing potential criminal referrals against CPS officers who approved malicious prosecutions. At home, we sat at the table with our children playing in the next room, the binders resting on a side chair like trophies. We'd won in courts, in committees, and in the legislature. Yet I knew the work of rebuilding trust was ongoing. New policies required training, oversight, and the continued courage of whistleblowers. I resolved to serve on a newly formed CPS Advisory Council, offering citizen input on policy and training modules. Anna and I donated a portion of our award to fund an annual scholarship for whistleblowers' legal defense, ensuring that future insiders could speak truth without fear of financial ruin. Symbols of transformation. At the victory celebration that evening, friends and family gathered in our backyard. Fairy lights twinkled among the oak branches. Neighbors shared food and laughter. Mateo toddled around, curious and unafraid. I brought out the baby sock in a glass dome, now etched with a brass plaque, symbol of resilience: Johnson, for use CPS, Legal Affairs 2025. Next to it, the wooden music box sat on a handcrafted shelf, its crank wound high before being lifted gently in front of the gathering. As its lullaby filled the night air, we raised glasses, sparkling cider, to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a Texas where government power is checked, where families are safeguarded, and where the rule of law stands inviolate. But as the lullaby faded, I sensed the undercurrent of perpetual vigilance. The next generation would watch these symbols and wonder if they too had the courage to stand against abuses of power. I squeezed Anna's hand and whispered, "We did it. Now let's make sure they never forget." And beneath the stars, in the hush that follows triumph, I realized the true victory. Ordinary citizens armed with truth and fortified by community can hold the most powerful institutions accountable, and in doing so, they forge a legacy of justice that outlasts any single battle.